Welcome to the CSAE Research Podcast, a series of conversation about research taking place at the Center for the Study of African Economies at the University of Oxford. I'm Olivier Sterck, Associate Professor and Senior Research Officer at the Department of International Development and a member of CSAE. You may know that there is mounting empirical evidence around the positive and persistent effects of cash-based assistance on the direct recipients of cash transfers. But there is actually limited research on the indirect effects of cash-based assistance, especially the effects on local businesses. Today, we'll be discussing the paper Cash Transfers and Micro-Enterprise Performance, Theory and Quasi-Experimental Evidence from Kenya. It was published recently in the Journal of Development Economics. And this study examines the business and price effects of a cash transfer program delivered to about 400,000 refugees in Kenya. The cash was given in monthly payments of $3 to $13, provided in the form of a digital money, exclusively usable for the purchases of food at licensed shops. Joining me today to discuss this project is Antonia, Delius, a DPhil student at the Department of Economics at the University of Oxford. So, to start with, maybe, can you tell me a bit what is the main research question in this paper and why do you think it's important according to you?
Thanks, Olivier. Sure. I think you've already teased a little bit what we're looking at. This study focuses on the effect of a cash assistance program, not on the direct recipients of the transfer, but on the businesses and the markets where the beneficiaries of the cash assistance program spend the money they get. This is a very exciting angle, I think, on cash transfers. There has been a lot of literature already on the direct impacts of recipients, but actually the welfare effects of cash assistance also depends on how businesses respond to the demand shock from the transfer and the resulting impacts on prices. So, for example, are businesses able to adjust their supply to meet the increased demands that beneficiaries will have after receiving a cash transfer? Or do they maybe increase their prices, for example? So there's really a theoretical motivation to study this angle of cash transfers, which maybe, Olivier, you can give a bit more details on.
Yes, but actually we built a theoretical model to better understand this theoretical prediction of the effect of cash transfers on businesses, because that, as you said, has been not studied to a great extent in the literature, and that's somehow surprising because if you think about it, actually, the direct impact of cash transfer on the direct beneficiaries, those who receive money, it depends on how businesses react to the cash transfer program first. So it's the first step of the causal chain, and so it's very important to look at this first step. And so we built a model. Basically, what we did is to adapt an old framework, which is called the Salop circle model. I'll not go into the math during this discussion, but you can find all the math, of course, in the paper. What was more important, perhaps, is the findings from this model, which I find very interesting. And in short, perhaps not surprisingly, the predicted impact of the transfer on households and on businesses will depend on the degree of competition between the businesses and also on the characteristics of the cash-based intervention. And I mean, the simplest case is the case of a perfectly competitive market and unrestricted cash transfer in this perfectly competitive market. Then basically the solution is simple, apart from a possible adjustment period in the short run, because businesses might not adapt their supply to the increased demand. Apart this short-term period of adjustment, basically businesses will not or are not expected to benefit from the transfers because price basically will be adjusted. They will be equal to their marginal cost. And so all the benefits of the cash transfers will be entirely reaped by the transfer recipients after the adjustment period. What is perhaps more interesting is when markets are not perfect, because in practice they are rarely perfect, especially in the context where we have been working in a refugee camp in a developing country context. Often you have regulation, you have credit constraints that can act as entry barriers in the formal sector. The prices are rarely indicated. Many people may have experience of having to negotiate prices in developing countries. Transportation costs can be very large. Roads are far from being perfect in the context where we work. They're often in poor condition. And there are fixed costs as well, implying that the typical assumption of non-increasing return to scale, it's often inaccurate or partly accurate. And so what we did, as I said, is to build a salop circle model to study the impact of this kind of market imperfection, typically entry barriers and transportation costs, on how that affect basically the impact of the cash transfers on businesses. And what we find is that with this kind of market imperfection, businesses can benefit from the transfer themselves. They can grab part of the benefits of the transfer by basically increasing their price. And we make several extensions to this model, but one that is important maybe to highlight is the case of restricted cash transfers. Why is it important? Is because it's a case that is actually type of cash transfer, we'll come back to that probably, that is very popular or very widespread, especially with humanitarian assistance and social assistance, is basically cash transfers that either can only be spent on certain goods or can only be spent at certain shops. There are many programs that are like that. You can think of humanitarian assistance. Sometimes it's limited to certain categories of food. For example, an NGO that has wash programs might restrict its cash transfer to hygiene products or things like that. The World Food Program with whom we worked, they might restrict cash transfers that they implement to food. But even in developed countries, you have many restricted programs. For example, in the US, you have the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program that is distributing electronic cash transfer restricted to food for almost 50 million Americans. So there are plenty of examples of restricted cash transfers. And what we find theoretically in the case of restricted cash transfers is that two different markets, parallel markets can coexist. One that is more competitive with lower price, it's the cash market, the traditional market, and then another market for the restricted cash transfers, which is less competitive and which has higher prices. Because of limited competition, the firms can have a higher market power. I noticed that some elements of my answer were referring to some important elements of context because we worked in a refugee camp. Maybe, Antonia, that's something you could explain to our audience. In what kind of context were we working? I've discussed about cash transfer in a refugee camp. What are the characteristics of this cash transfer program? Or maybe you can tell us a bit more.
Sure, happy to. So the specific program that we studied was a cash transfer program for refugees in Kenya. Kenya hosts quite a lot of refugees and has for many years, who are mainly from the neighboring countries, Somalia, South Sudan, and also a range of other countries in the region. Most refugees in Kenya live in camps or camp-like settlements, which are typically located in rural areas near the borders, across which many of these refugees flee. In those camp-like setups, economic opportunities are typically relatively limited, which means a very large part of the refugee population strongly has to rely on humanitarian aid, which in this context is provided by a couple of different actors, but one of the very big programs is the food aid program from the World Food Program, which is the one that we're evaluating. We've collaborated very closely with WFP to understand this program and to implement this study. The way it is set up is through this food aid program from WFP. Refugees in the Kenyan refugee camps receive a monthly cash transfer, which is implemented as a digital mobile money transfer. So recipients basically have a digital wallet that is linked to their SIM card, in which they receive an amount of money every month. It varies a bit on their individual situation and the location they live in, how much they receive. This transfer is restricted such that it can only be spent on food items. So the way it works is that this digital mobile money transfer can only be spent at licensed traders who've been selected by the WFP to be able to sell in exchange for this digital currency. And the traders are only allowed to sell food items to beneficiaries of this cash assistance program. The focus of our research is on these licensed businesses. They can sell to refugees who are getting this cash transfer. And we are interested in what is the impact of this program setup on these businesses and the market they operate in. The way to become one of those licensed traders was set up through an open application process. The World Food Programme asked for applications from traders to become licensed to trade in the cash transfer program. And several times there were a couple of iterations of the applications. And the first step was very simple. Applicants had to fill in an application form. Interviewers came to the market areas and encouraged traders to sign up, supported them in filling the form and kind of gathering all the necessary information. It was a relatively basic application. They had to describe the characteristics of their business. So, for example, what kinds of products do they sell and where they're located, the nationality of the business owner, some demographics like that. Once all of the applications were collected, they were basically compiled in a spreadsheet, which was handed off to a multi-stakeholder committee with representatives from several humanitarian organizations, the government of Kenya, the different groups that have a stake in this system. And they selected traders to become licensed to sell for the cash transfer mobile money, basically aiming to select a very diverse group of traders. So there was no kind of selection based on a specific score or certain criteria that had to always be met. The aim was basically to put together a group of traders that is very diverse in terms of the markets they work in, their nationalities and the languages they speak, the types of things they sell, the gender of the business owner, and so on. Yeah, and during the implementation of this study, we spent a lot of time in the refugee camps where this program is implemented to really understand the context very well and collect the data. So, Olivier, could you maybe tell us a bit more about what the data collection for this project was like?
Yes, thank you. Our paper draws on 4 types of data, like very rich set of data sets. So first, we use the exact same data sets that you described, Antonia. The data set that the selection committee used to allocate business license, Bamba Chakula licenses. The name of the program was Bamba Chakula. And this data set contains all the information that shop owners provided when they applied to this program. So that means all the information that the selection committee used to make decisions when selecting the firms that could benefit ultimately from the cash transfers. We will use these data sets to be able to implement matching methods because we have the exact same knowledge as the selection committee that decided who would be treated or who would be in the control group. The second data set that we used is data from a survey that we did with businesses in the Kakuma refugee camp and the Kalobei settlement, which is somehow a camp that is just next to the Kakuma refugee camp, and it's often considered as one big camp, the Kakuma refugee camp and the Kalobei settlement. We did that survey in 2018. We recruited 20 enumerators. Actually, Antonia, you were the main person coordinating the field work as part of your MPhil thesis. So I'm sure you have better placed actually to answer this question than myself. We trained 20 enumerators for a few days. We discussed all the questions. We practiced the questionnaire with them. We did at least one pilot survey, which each of them, we explained the relevant concept, etc. And our objective was basically to interview all the refugees that had applied to get a Bamba Chakula license, whether they got it or whether they didn't get it. Basically, we followed the list of applicants received by WFP. We tried to find them, and then we did the interview with questions on business characteristics, business practices, living standards, extensive information on shop owners, their households, etc. Third data set that we used is a household data set that was collected the same year, a bit before. We used that data set to measure prices. And then finally, the fourth type of data that we use is qualitative data. That's not really typical perhaps for papers in economics, but that's something that has always been very important in our research group. We collect both quantitative and qualitative data because we like to triangulate basically the findings from both approach and use a mixed method approach. That's also important because we are working hands in hands with the World Food Programme. And they are interested in policy insight. And when we write reports with them, like for them or with them, they like to have also quotes, anecdotes, or stories that can back the points that we make with quantitative data and numbers. And so we did 122 qualitative interviews with business owners, with their clients, but also with different stakeholders that were interviewed in the program. But so as I said, actually, you coordinated data collection. So I think you are better placed to discuss about this, because the fieldwork was part of your thesis. So when you were doing an MPhil in economics, and then actually you used the data in your MPhil using matching methods, basically to study the impacts of the business licenses. And so let me jump on that to ask you about matching methods. That is a difficult question. It has bad press in economics, unfortunately for us, but I think that's partly unfair. In our paper, we argue that, at least in our case study, we have a perfect case where matching methods can perhaps be used. And let me be blunt, maybe it can be as good as randomization. So can you tell us a bit why you think this is the case, or maybe why you think this is not the case, and how we have been implementing matching methods in practice?
Absolutely. Yeah, before I get into the technicalities of the matching approach, basically what we want to evaluate with this very rich data that Olivier has described is the impact of the cash transfer program on these licensed businesses that can sell food to beneficiaries of the cash transfer. And to do this, we need a credible comparison group of businesses who are not licensed, but otherwise comparable. We obtained this comparable group of businesses by exploiting the quasi-random variation in the allocation of the licenses using matching methods. And the way we do this came up a couple of times before. We obtain the full application data from the World Food Program that was available to the people who selected the traders. And we use it to match traders who did not get the license, who looked similar at the application stage. And I think here, a very important component to using this data well and to being able to argue that that matching is a credible approach in this context is really sort of the very extensive time we and I in particular, as Olivier mentioned, spent in the camps and spent working with WFP and really understanding every single step of the selection process, looking at the data, at the application forms that were collected, how the data was compiled, how exactly it looked when it was provided to the selection committee. So basically the way we use this is we match businesses that are comparable based on the characteristics that are available in the application data. And that basically means that we can compare similar businesses based on observable characteristics at the time of the applications for a license. In addition, though, it is important to make a convincing argument that there are not actually any unobservable characteristics that potentially make these groups different. And I think that's where this context comes in. Firstly, only work with businesses that have applied to participate in the program. That's very important for any selection on unobservable characteristics. We only work with businesses who were sort of motivated to participate in this program, who took the initiative to apply in the first place. Then we used the data that the selection committee had available, and we know that no other data was used in this process, so they should not have had any information on any of the other characteristics of these businesses, except for what is available in that data set that we also access. And we also have a very detailed understanding of how the licensing process took place, and a detail that really helps us in the matching approach is that the committee did not create a score or ranking or aim to select the businesses that are already the largest or most successful, but really aimed to select a diverse group of traders, which introduced quite some level of randomness in terms of who actually ended up getting selected. And then finally, another part that really makes these businesses comparable, that is quite important, is that the businesses operate in the same markets, in the same marketplaces, in the same context, and they participate in the same surveys. The only difference really is some have been selected to participate in this Bambachakula program where cash transfer beneficiaries can come and spend their mobile money transfer on food items, and others have not been selected for this program. We also run a range of checks on the data that provide further reassurance that there are no unobservable differences between the businesses with and without a license before the implementation of the program. So we run a couple of placebo tests where we basically confirm that the treatment status is not correlated with any predetermined characteristics of the business owners that could be proxies for entrepreneurial ability. So, for example, their education level, whether their family used to own a business before they started the current one, whether they participated in any business trainings, characteristics like that. And we also confirm that proxies for business size and capacity don't predict at all the probability of receiving a license. It is really only the characteristics that were considered in the selection by the selection committee.
Yes, and maybe to add to that, sorry to interrupt you.
Sure.
Like, I think I remember, I might be wrong on the exact number, but that in the first stage of the matching procedure, it's something like 17% or 20% of the variation in the allocation of license. So the pseudo I-squared, basically, that we calculated, it's about 0.2. And that's it. It's interesting in itself because it shows that the variables that basically were used by the selection committee to allocate license predicted the allocation of license. They used this data set, but there is also a lot of quasi-randomness that can be exploited, and that's actually that quasi-randomness that we're exploiting afterwards to assess the impact of the license. Basically, there is a lot of quasi-randomness that implies that similar businesses before the allocation of businesses got or didn't get the license and can be compared afterwards. Sorry for interrupting you.
No problem. Thanks for the addition. And yeah, that really makes an important point in terms of sort of predicting, using all of the data we have, trying to predict who was how likely to get one of these licenses. And an important finding here is that indeed only the variables that were used by the selection committee have some predictive power, but not actually that much. So there's some randomness here. And then at the same time, any other variables that we include in the prediction estimation that were not considered by the selection committee, none of these have any predictive power, which is consistent with them not having any additional information on the size and capacity of the businesses. We were already very convinced by this approach and sort of very sure that the selection committee really only had the application data available in their decision-making process. But these additional tests are really reassuring that this is indeed what happened, and we don't have any other systematic differences between these types of businesses that could potentially impact the results. Yeah, so just to wrap up this point, so comparing the business outcomes and business practices of businesses with and without the Bamba Chakula license, to do that, we evaluate the difference between these two matched types of differences. To get at the impact of getting a license on a business compared to a counterfactual where food assistance is not distributed through a market setup. So in this context, for example, it could alternatively be distributed through in-kind assistance like it was the case before the introduction of this cash transfer for a program. Olivier, maybe with that, I'll hand over to you. Feel free to complement further, but it would also be great if you could talk a bit about the results we find from this comparison.
Yes, nothing to add. I'm completely convinced that that's a perfect setup to implement matching methods. Thank you. And indeed, let's turn to the findings because they're actually very interesting. So we find large impacts from this allocation of license on the businesses that were selected to get the license. What does it suggest? What's the big picture message? Basically, it suggests that markets are far from being perfectly competitive in the Kakuma refugee camp and the Kado Bay settlement. So applicants selected to get a license, they massively benefited from the cash transfer programs. That means also that that's at the expense of beneficiaries. That means that they could increase their price, and we'll come back to that later, and thereby grab part of the benefits of the cash transfer program for their benefits. And what we find in terms of impact is that licensed applicants have more monthly businesses revenue that are $3,000 to $4,000 higher on average than unlicensed applicants. So it's an increase of 175%. So that's a massive increase in business revenues. Profit is also, the impact of profit is also positive and large, $685 more than in licensed applicants. That's massive in this context, and I'll provide some numbers to compare later. But the licensed applicants, they also have more employees, they have higher labor productivity, they sell more types of commodities, more goods. So that's for the impact on the businesses themselves. But we also actually asked these business owners to give us some information about their households. And we also find that the households of these business owners are benefiting from the cash transfers if they were selected to get a Bamba Chakula license. They are more food secure and have more diverse diets. Also, they have more assets than those in the control group. But the total household income is also increased thanks to the license. We don't find that these households which received a license reduce the other type of business activities or employment opportunities that they could have otherwise done. Actually, we don't find a crowding out effect on other income opportunities. So we just find additional income and profit thanks to the license. And there are two things that could explain basically why successful applicants have such higher revenue and profit. First, they are more likely to have a businesses at the time of the survey. So it's between 1 and 3 years after the allocation of licenses. Basically, there are 24 percentage points more likely to have a business. But it's not only that. It's not only that they are more likely to have a business. It's also that their business is more successful. We estimate that the effect of getting a license on profits is higher than $500 per month on businesses that would exist even in the absence of the cash transfer program. And that's a lower bound estimate. So that's extremely large. Like, it might not seem that large if you're in Oxford and you're used to wage in the Western world, but in a camp context, it's extremely large. It's about 18 times the average monthly wage of paid employees in Kakuma, and 39 times the value of monthly assistance per refugee. So these businesses, the impact on the profit is not their profit; it's the impact on their profit is really massive. I've said that there was also, of course, an impact on prices, and it's through this effect on prices that we think these businesses are increasing their profits. Maybe, Antonia, that's something you can tell us a bit more.
Absolutely. As Olivier mentioned, another important component to understanding really what this cash transfer does to the market was to understand the impact of the transfer on prices. In general, the World Food Program requires businesses to charge the same prices, whether it's a cash transaction or a transaction that is through this mobile money transfer. But in practice, that doesn't necessarily happen. It's very difficult to observe in this context where there's no formal bookkeeping requirement or anything like that. So to study the impact on the prices further, we implemented a household survey to really get at the information on what beneficiaries in practice spend when they're purchasing items with cash or with the Bamba Chakula transfer. In this household survey, we collected a detailed consumption module where we asked for a range of food items, whether the household consumed them, how the quantity that was consumed, how they obtained it, so whether they bought it with hard cash, with the digital Bamba Chakula transfer, or they obtained it through some other means, and which price they paid. That way, we obtained data on many purchases that were done both with hard cash and through the Bamba Chakula system. And this data allows us to assess how different prices are between these two modalities using regression analysis. But we also control for a range of different factors that could impact prices, such as the specific market, the quality, bulk purchases, etc. So depending on the exact specification, what we find is that prices for purchases that were the digital cash transfer versus hard cash are between 16 and 30% higher. So that means that consumers who buy items using the cash transfer money pay much higher prices than if they were to purchase the exact same item with hard cash. And this, of course, impacts how much beneficiaries get out of this transfer. If prices are 16 to 30% higher, they will be able to purchase correspondingly fewer items with the same amount of money. This is also actually a finding that came out particularly strongly in the qualitative work we did in the same context. These higher prices when purchasing items with the money from the transfer are a source of quite some frustration among beneficiaries. And it's also sort of a fact that is very well known that different prices are charged in these two different market systems for cash and the transfer.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that these things are very well known. And I would say that a lot of the findings actually maybe in our research are sometimes very well known by the refugees that are participating in our survey. And our results are often confirming what I would say everyone knows in the camp. And that's also why I'm somehow very much convinced that the matching methods that we are using in this research are leading us to accurate like unbiased findings, is because findings are not actually that surprising if you spend quite a bit of time in the camp doing research.
Yeah, I totally agree. And yeah, I think overall we really saw there is a big impact on kind of the market structure that goes beyond the direct beneficiaries, and that really impacts how the direct beneficiaries can use that transfer. But yeah, maybe before we go into sort of what does this mean for policy and so on, shall we briefly touch on some challenges we faced with this project? We already spoke a bit about the challenges with matching and that it really required to showcase that in this scenario, this is a strong approach, but also some other sort of tricky bits in the data. Olivier, do you want to take that on?
Yes, thanks. I see that time is flying, so I'll try to briefly explain a few of the challenges that we faced. Maybe the first one that we faced, or during the field work, the main challenge was basically to find businesses. Addresses are not always available. Business names are not always very clear. So we had to do quite extensive search to find some of the businesses. And actually, we did quite well. And thank you, Antonia, for that. We managed to find 93.8% of all the applicants. That's very, very good. And among these, 86% more or less were interviewed. So it's relatively high success rate, given that we are talking about mobile populations here. 12% of the total set of applicants actually left the camp. So it's not that we didn't do our job correctly. It's just that they could not be found because they moved permanently or they were deceased. There are 2% of the people that we could not, that we find but did not agree. So that's very little. So overall, I feel that that's a challenge that we managed quite well, thanks to our presence, especially your presence on the field. There are two other challenges that we face when processing data, and I want to briefly mention them. The first one is that some of our measures or variables of interest, for example, revenue, profit, etc., they have numerous zeros, and they typically have dispersed right tails with large outliers. Without zeros, we could just use a log transformation, as is typical in economics, but with the zeros, it's more complicated. Initially, we used the inverse hyperbolic sin transformation that was promoted at that time in economics, but soon we discovered that the results were not making sense, and so we relegated these results basically in the appendix because they were way too large. They were just not plausible. They were not making sense compared to the result we were obtaining with the variables before the transformation, basically. And so we created a new method to deal with this kind of variable that has zeros or negative values and skewed data. Our idea was that instead of using the log transformation or inverse hyperbolic sin transformation, the idea is basically to use a quantile transformation. So basically transform the data to go from 0 to 1 and rely on the percentile or the quantile of the distribution of the variable. And that means that instead of interpreting the result in percentage term, as you would do with a log transformation, basically you interpret the result in percentile terms. So it's relatively intuitive. But for more details, you can basically look at the paper. And then final challenge with the data that we face and we try to solve in the paper is the fact that some of the businesses, basically, they were not existing anymore. And so there is the question of how to account for that in the analysis. These people that we interviewed, they have no business anymore. So what should we do? Should we put a zero instead of like for their profit? For their revenue, should we put a zero? Should we impute the data, or should we consider them as missing value? Should this observation be dropped when we analyze impact on revenue and profit? And this is a bit technical, but basically in the paper, we propose a method to calculate lower bound estimates of the average treatment effect that takes into account basically these zeros. And it's then the lower bound estimate of the average treatment effect on the always trader, what we call. So that's it on the firm that would still have a business, even if they did not get the license. Again, it's probably better explained in the paper. Now that it's probably time to conclude, maybe let's take a step back and think about the big picture message that we want to convey during this podcast. What do you think we learn about markets in the refugee camp? What are the big picture conclusion or the recommendation that you would make in 1 or 2 minutes to the people who are listening?
Thanks. I'll try to keep this brief. For me, really the key lesson of this project is that it's really important to look beyond the direct beneficiaries when designing cash transfer programs, and also when evaluating their impact. On the latter point, we see that business owners massively benefit. They made huge profits from this program. So actually, the positive impact that the cash transfer program has on people in the context is not only the impact that we see on direct beneficiaries, but also on the owners of the shops where this transfer is spent. So only looking at the impact on direct beneficiaries may actually underestimate the positive effects that cash transfer programs can have. That effect, of course, can multiply in the economy, since the business owners, again, spent their transfer in the local markets in this context.
What would you recommend to NGOs trying to implement these kind of programs?
So I think at the same time, in designing cash transfer programs, the design features of the program can be really important for who gets the welfare gains from the transfer. I think organizations should look at the market imperfections that exist in the context they work in, but also think about how the design features of the transfers are going to shape that market. In particular, if there's any factors that limit market competition, either as part of the transfer design, if you limit the number of businesses that can participate, or due to market imperfections that already exist beforehand, businesses might be able to extract very high profits based on the program. I guess if strengthening local businesses is one of your goals, this might not be too problematic. But I think in this context in particular, and in many similar ones, recipients of humanitarian and social support programs are often in very precarious situations, and maximizing the welfare gain they get from the program tends to be a key priority. So if that is really the main goal, thinking about how to strengthen competition in the market where the transfer is spent to ensure beneficiaries benefit also from prices that are as low as possible should really be a key priority in thinking about the implementation details. Yeah, with that, back to you, Olivier, if you want to add anything. And then we can wrap up.
No, thanks a lot. I think we can wrap up. This is part of a long partnership with the World Food Programme, and maybe I want to conclude by thanking them for the support that they have provided in the field to help us with basically everything. It's a partnership we started in 2017, and that is still ongoing. So let me end on that acknowledgement, and let me also thank everyone who has participated in that research. It's not only Antonia and myself, of course. There was a huge team of people helping us on the ground, and this research would not have been possible without them. Let me end the podcast here, Antonia, and by thanking you as well for joining me in this interesting discussion. Thank you also to everyone who is listening this research podcast of the CSAE. We hope you'll be joining us soon again next time. And to listen to more episodes of the series, please go on the CSAE website. Thanks a lot.
Bye.